Okay, it looks like everyone is here. I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Welcome to the Virtual Caput Center. We are delighted that you're joining us for this week's colloquium. Before we get started, I want to remind you to join us on April 8th for Xandra de Araujo, who will be talking about re-examining assumptions, and on April 29th, when Dr. Robert Gigier will be talking about the work he does around citizen science with bees. Now I'm excited to tell you about today's speaker. Many years ago, I joined a colleague for dinner and a couple grad students tagged along with him. Little did I know that I was meeting someone whose work I would follow for the next decade and who I would be introducing this afternoon. Let's see, Deborah Fields is an associate research professor in instructional technology and the learning sciences at Utah State University. Her work is all situated in making with the dedication to children's creative expression with digital media, coding, and everyday craft materials. Because of this, her work breaks down stereotypes about who can create with digital media and computing. She was the lead developer of the E-textiles Exploring Computer Science curricular unit and has been part of training many teachers to support students in learning to design and code in creative ways. In addition to her work appearing in high-ranked journals, Dr. Fields is also a fellow of the International Society of Design and Development in Education, and it is my pleasure to host her for today's Caput Center colloquium. And I will turn it over to Debbie.
You never know where dinner is going to lead, do you?
You really don't.
All right, so let's get started here. This will involve a little bit of audience participation here and there. So put your mindset. I like to design talks to be interactive if possible and to sort of get ideas from you, because I think that's how we learn better versus me just talking. So we're going to see how this goes, but we can flex a little bit. So let's see if I can share this screen and then start the slideshow. All right, can you all see that all right? Okay, so I see a few of you on the side. Hopefully you can see my full screen. So I am going to be talking about E-textiles in school. Chandra asked me in particular, said there were a lot of people who are involved in formal schooling. And so I'm going to take you a little bit on a journey for some of the work that I've done in schools, from curriculum to teaching and making and the whole bit. But I want to start with a question. So I would like you to type into chat, but not press return. We're going to press return at the same time. You can have like 30 seconds, a minute, somewhere around their lines. What is something you remember making as a kid? And, you know, don't just say I made a treehouse. More than one word answer is preferred. You know, something about it. So maybe take another 10 or 15 seconds to finish typing. And then go ahead and press return. I'm going to open up chat. Ooh, so much fun. And just think about how long ago it was when you were a kid and you made that and you still remember. I remember making my first knitted, actually, let me go back. My grandmother taught me how to do a needlepoint. I was 5 and I was so excited. I went and finished it on my own. And I don't know what it looked like because whatever it looked like, she went and completely tore it apart and redid it. So I don't know what mistake I made. In my eyes as a 5-year-old, it was great, but I'm sure it was quite interesting. And, you know, I'm a maker in my everyday life. So I am wearing this and this that I've made. So yeah, but let me just ask you a couple questions, not to type, but just to think. That thing that you made, did it go well the first time? Like, to go perfectly, like it all went smoothly? Did you learn anything in the process of creating it? And was this a purely individual thing, or was it involving other people? Even other people in terms of instruction manuals or sites you might have drawn on or something like that. So even though I'm going to guess and hypothesize, could be wrong, could be like purely individual, you probably got an idea from someone. You probably saw a sandcastle somewhere before thinking to make it yourself, or heard about it through a friend. Like I was introduced by my grandmother to needlepoint, which was like a historical, activity passed down to her. And you probably, I saw some, did not go well the first time, like mine did not. I'm constantly pulling stuff apart and redoing it. So those are just some things to keep in mind about making. Okay. So this is one thing that I've made. I wanted to give, since I'm going to be talking about E-textiles, I needed to show an E-textile. This is from, 2011, so a little while ago. And I was at an astronomy camp. You can see the lights on the bottom, people talking about stuff. But this is a great example. We have a microcontroller here, which I put on my back because I figured it wouldn't hurt much, like, leaning on that part. I put these two conductive patches. This was an astronomy camp in southern Arizona. So we have saguaros, and the Saturn image is sort of the logo of the camp. Actually, these two pieces together are, so I separated them out. And I thought I designed a shoulder massage shirt. So it didn't show it in action, but if you pressed on both parts, the harder you press, you can get different lighting patterns. So sort of a light touch, no touch obviously has these going in a circle, but they can go back and forth and sort of cross. I had, we didn't have time in the camp for the kids to make the product themselves. Sewing takes a little bit of time to learn. They're not going to design something like this with just 1 hour of experience. So I did the sewing and they coded Saturn in different ways. And then I put their code in. My dad owns this, so I can't show it to you in person, but I was rather proud of it. So that's a bit of how E-textile works. No, there we go. Here's some more. Basically, I need to, for a whole talk, you kind of got to understand what E-textiles are. So we use microcontrollers. This is one called the LilyPad that are sewable. So we're literally sewing computers. Sew stuff onto fabrics, but I have actually seen kids use balsa wood or tape things down onto paper. So textiles writ broadly. And we connect things with conductive threads. So we're literally sewing electronics. So the electronics go through this thread that has metal spun into it in some way or another. And, we often use sensors like those two patches that you saw. Those are sensors. They sense whether someone's touching them. Really, they're sensing those two, whether anyone's conducting electricity through them with your body. So that's very fun. But you can have light sensors, sound sensors, motion sensors, so many sensors. So that's sort of what the kids are using. And yep, so they involve circuitry. Here's some kids' projects. This is a basic wristband. Here's some other fun stuff. They involve coding. In particular, we generally use this code platform called Arduino. It's text-based. So some of you may have used block-based languages like Scratch, maybe? Anyone use Scratch? No, maybe, yeah, okay. There are so many great coding platforms for novices these days. I learned on Scratch when I was a grad student, and I've progressed a little since then. And so here's the challenge. If you've heard about maker spaces and such, then you know that making can be very individualized and highly unique. So this poses a challenge when we go into classrooms. So a lot of my colleagues like Paulo Blickstein do stuff in maker spaces, and Paulo, the way he generally does making is you come in and you make something and you get supports for making it. You might go through very many iterations, but not everyone's making the thing that you're making. That doesn't really work when you only have one person and 40 students. So a lot of the design of the curriculum that I'm going to talk about has some questions, right? How do we create something where, here we go. How do we create a scenario where all kids are learning rigorous concepts, like we have to fit this in a school discipline. I generally work within CS. I have some colleagues who work in science or career and technical education. There's some overlap there. But we do this in schools. At the same time, we also want to make it personal and cultural. So how do we support a personal and culturally relevant space? Okay. How do we do this with one instructor in the room? And how do we make sure that we promote equity? So all these things are important, and these went into the design of our curriculum. And if you want, I can talk more about that later. In general, when we talk about equity, it helps to define what we mean by it. This is what we mean: broaden access. We want more people to participate who don't always get the chance to participate. We want to deepen access. I don't want a surface participation where you make a little thing and move on. I want depth, so they're learning disciplinary content that gives them the tools to go further. And diversity. Want to diversify what students are creating. So that means like the fabric stuff really blows people's minds about what you can do with computing. And that goes a long ways towards getting kids to think about computing differently. So it's not just on the screen and sort of hunker down and blah, 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 blah. That's usually the image people have of coding. So briefly, here are 4 of like, I don't know, a dozen design principles of our curriculum. We have them do 4 projects. Each one takes a little bit longer or a lot longer. The first one's like an hour and involves one light, and we're just using paper and stickers and tape. And the next one is those wristbands you saw. And then we get into other projects. And the final project is basically a version of my Saturn shirt where you have 2 metal patches and you squeeze them to create different lighting conditions. This means there's no single point of failure. Kids build on their experience. They could totally mess up one project, and that doesn't mean that their last one's going to be messed up. In fact, often we see students who struggle earlier just really thrive at the end. We want to draw on diverse expertise. Alliteration in presentations is dangerous. So everyone brings something. So we have kids who have some sewing experience, or I've seen kids who have never sewn before, but their grandmother's a seamstress, and kablam, they just take to it like fish in water. Coding, circuitry, design, art, all these sorts of things. People tend to maybe be a little bit better at one than another when they start, but everyone has to learn something. Another key, and this gets into the personal and cultural relevance, is foregrounding aesthetics. So we always, always, always start with sketching an idea of what you want, which usually is impossible. A lot of kids like, I want my name in bling, or I want to do this project with 40 lights. We're like, no, you're a beginner. You're not going to do something with 40 lights. Or the coding that you would have to do to make that thing work is a little much, but they still have ownership of an idea where they start. And then only after they have that idea on paper in some way, do we start showing them how to create things. Do we introduce basic circuitry or basic coding or basic sewing? Their project transforms, and we can trace learning through the iterations of the project development. And in fact, in that process, we get to this valuing mistakes. So we are pointing out to them that process is important. And one of the things I'm going to show in this presentation are some portfolios that students have made, where we make them actually take pictures of all their mistakes, and you choose a couple to show in a portfolio at the end. So it's not just their final product, whether it works or not, that's important, but also this process of learning, like, well, I faced this challenge and here's how I dealt with it, or not. So all those things are important. Briefly, these are our projects. You don't need to read them all, but what's important about this is that we are meeting various standards in computer science and engineering and those sorts of things. So each project has its goals, and they're learning about circuitry. We're introducing different materials. They don't get all the new materials at once. We layer them on. They're getting experience with sewing, and then coding. So they layer on top of each other. The best way to describe this is to show you this video. This is going to be fun. It's with a class. I was just in this class last week. Now there are new students in it. So let's see if I can play this video for you here. I promise I loaded this beforehand, but sound okay?
programming. I've never done anything with computers in general.
Because I thought it was gonna be like all about computers and stuff.
Yeah.
But it's not.
I thought it was going to be a little bit harder to do.
At first, I thought you had to be really smart to code.
The E-textiles unit covers a series of different projects. Each one builds on the next. The students start out by making simple circuits and then eventually making parallel circuits with switches and computational circuits that they can program in customized ways. The programming includes a lot of challenging concepts, basic sequences, embedded conditionals, Boolean statements, mathematical operators, using sensors, and thinking through the logic of how to program those sensors. It's not just crafting, it's sewing combined with circuitry. I love what you might call the hybrid nature of E-textiles.
To see the possible connections between crafting, computing, and engineering.
Our E-textiles unit seeks to bring making into computer science classrooms. We want to broaden who is participating in making in computer science. We want to deepen their learning by providing meaningful challenges to students. And we want to diversify who is making and what they are making. We're doing this by focusing on student-driven handcrafts.
Electronic crafting projects are not so much about teaching students stitching. Involves a lot of problem solving and thinking about procedures and steps, which I think connect very closely to thinking about computing and procedures.
But it's that transformation from their original ideas to what works and learning the skills, both programming skills and circuitry and crafting and all of those ways that those interweave.
It's usable. You can take it home with you.
Kids come in at lunch that I've never seen ever outside of the classroom without me asking them to. They just come because they want to do extra work or they want to make sure their project works.
I like to do challenging things.
Okay, so yay, video. I hope that gave a bit of perspective on the project. I love the kids. We don't tell them what to say, and they say these amazing things. So I understand that most of you here are sort of developing as researchers and educators. So I wanted to give some perspective. This curriculum did not come out of nothing. So I wrote out, I started doing E-textiles in 2010. My boss, Yasmin Kafai, who you just saw at the time, had just finished my dissertation. She handed me a LilyPad Arduino, one of those microcontrollers, and said, okay, make educational activities for kids. So I learned the hard way how to do it. And we really didn't know what we were doing, but we learned by trial and error in pilot workshops where we had 2 or 3 of us at a time with maybe 10 to 15 students. And we sort of slowly developed this model of everyone making the same thing, but a lot of personal expression and diversity in what they're making. Then I got an assistant professor job and I was able to teach a craft technology class, which was great because I can assign students homework at university level. And that meant I could go really far with E-textiles and start seeing what people made once they had some basic skills down. And then we realized there was an opportunity to make a curriculum. So we partnered with Exploring Computer Science. The people who've done Exploring Computer Science are amazing. They developed a year-long equity-driven, like it's at the heart of everything they do, computer science curriculum. And this really, when they were developing it in the mid-2000s, there was nothing like this around where they're taking computer science into classrooms, but not at AP level. Like there was AP ECS, but nothing lower, and not everyone's ready to just jump into AP computer science. So within that, we made an alternative unit 6. And E-textiles and ECS, I mean, we're drawing on a lot of the principles that they have in ECS, but it's still very, very drastically different. I mean, we have to teach teachers how to use supplies. Like they have to pull out sewing supplies in computer science. That's not normally what happens in computer science class. There's a lot. So we built on this, 2 teachers in year 1, and Angela, who you saw in that video, is one of them. Then we developed 4 teachers, and I put teacher focus. The first year we focused on what the teachers were doing. Then we revised the curriculum. The second year we focused on case study students, about 12 in each class with 4 teachers. No, 4 in each class. Yep, 16 total. And then in year 3, we did 16 teachers, and we did a more quantitative focus where we weren't going to classrooms. Instead, we did some surveys and some assessments, and I'll share some of those. Overlapping with this, we got another grant to study debugging more specifically. So in computer science, debugging is when you find a problem, a bug, and then you fix it. And in the spirit of learning by creating things, we decided, oh, what would happen if we had students create the bugs for each other? And that has been a wild riot of a ride. So much fun. And we just finished year 3, all virtual, a quasi-experimental study where we basically like, here's a normal E-textiles unit, and then here's an E-textiles unit with debugging by design. There's a few more nuances than that, but that's the basic thing. And sort of, well, does debugging by design make a difference? And it did, much to our shock and awe. And now we are exploring more with teachers directly. So we're expanding our teacher cohort to not just be in Southern California, where I am based, but around the country, which means we need to do a virtual professional development. So we have learned how to teach teachers how to sew virtually, which also not trivial. We just keep coming up with challenges for ourselves. But now we have enough teachers from this iteration that they're training these teachers, and I'm more the assistant to them, which it's much more authentic because honestly, the teachers who've done it in their classrooms know way more about the teaching the curriculum than I do at this point. So we've done a lot of research. I decided to map it out on a bit of a thought map. And you might want to take a screenshot of this, especially if you're coming to the Q&A session after, because I can talk about any of these things, but I obviously can't talk about all of them in, 45 minutes. So I'm just going to highlight some of the things later. But, we looked at equitable teaching practices, emergent adaptations of teachers, like what were they doing that we didn't expect them to do? We looked at student identity. We looked at artistic dimensions of projects. We looked at collaboration between students, which happened the most when they were debugging their own projects. So that was exciting to find. I colored these 2. These are 2 of our more quantitative studies. We mostly have done more qualitative work. But when our research questions call for it, we go and dip into quantitative work. And I was just working on a paper on that today. So the 2 foci have been teachers or students. It's hard to do both at the same time unless you have a massive research team. So that's kind of, we've focused on one or the other each year. So this is the next part of interactions. So I'm going to show you a student's portfolio, and actually this student and his project, a lightsaber, I think that's the one I chose, were in that little video. You probably saw this big floppy blue thing. And I want you to just take a moment to read these things and tell me what you see. So if you care about identity, you might look at identity. If you care about learning, you might sort of say, what can I learn about a student's learning in this? And, if you were looking at researching these, what would you be interested in analyzing? So you might look at communication, content, identity, problem solving, and here we go. So this is a student portfolio. Student created a lightsaber from Star Wars. The gray part is on the handle. Remember my project with the Saturn shirt worked with patches. The student put those 2 patches on the handle so he can grab them both at the same time. And depending on how hard you squeeze it, get these different lighting patterns. They might be all on, or 1, 2, 3. Or 1 off, on, 2 off, on, 3 off, on. And then this is like a flashy pattern, all on, off, really flashy. Here's some pictures of the project in process, or maybe finished. This is finished, including a circuit diagram. Notice the circuit diagram has 2 sides because this is the project unfolded, and then it gets folded in on itself with some stuffing. So this is their reporting on a coding challenge. This is the wrong code. The problem I had was that I was putting the semicolon outside of the bracket, but the revision I needed was putting the semicolon inside of the bracket. That was a hard one to see because it's a minor problem and most people wouldn't have caught it. You can see right here. And this is another challenge, was trying to connect the handle to the saber part and connecting the foil to the circuit playground. So the foil has to be connected to the microcontroller, this little circular computer here. So they pointed out the problems. And this is a final reflection, the last slide. The major thing I have improved on was my sewing. Before I didn't know how to sew. I thought you needed a sewing machine. Realized that's not true. You can use your arms. I love it, using your arms to sew. Needle and thread, no machine. It's amazing. This would be helpful. I know I have to ask my mom to sew something if I get a small tear. So this is a new skill that'll help me. And I won't have to pay people to fix my clothes. Okay, so type into chat, please, and press return when you're ready. What are some things that you noticed about this? What the student learned, how they learned, maybe something about how they're identifying, problem solving, any of it. And go ahead and press return whenever you're ready. It's not too fair to make you analyze data right in the middle of a presentation you're attending, but you know. Ooh, I love this. Everyone's focusing on something different. So go ahead and keep those reflections coming in. I'm enjoying this. Oh yeah, this was their final picture. You can see, look, it's a stuffed lightsaber. That's so cool. So here's some of what we saw when we analyzed this and other projects. This is one analysis that we did that was focused on computational thinking practices. We focused a lot on debugging. So we noticed a lot of students were able to name a problem. And that is like, even just being able to isolate and name a problem is a big deal. Isolating it, maybe if there were multiple possibilities, they're able to isolate it, like the way the student realized eventually, oh, it's the semicolon is in the wrong place. Not this student, but a number of others were testing and refining things iteratively. Describing a solution. So the lightsaber student definitely described a solution a couple times. Some, they didn't have to problem solve because they avoided the problem altogether with some careful planning. And they said that was something that they learned. And others also changed a project to make it more usable, right? Or to make it more aesthetically pleasing to draw people in, or like, you know, maybe not everyone could squeeze the patches and make things happen. So they had to adjust their parameters. Here's another portfolio. I love this, sketched 6 different papers. And on the 6th page was one that came out fine. So this was just all in their circuit diagram, right? So they did a lot of planning and finally figured out a way to orient. The sewing is not that easy, and you don't want to cross your positive and negative lines, which are really easy to do when it's all just that same gray color. It's not insulated thread, so you touch 2 pieces and you could get a little heating problem with your short circuit. So we find a lot of spatial awareness develops. The same student, I believe, challenge was programming. Got help. Added some patterns, and here are some images of her program. So we did another analysis of the same portfolios looking at identities. So a couple of you wrote like how empowered students seemed. So we noted that CS was a personal space for them where they could be personally expressive, and it was also social. So for instance, this student talking about getting help from two other students. In effect, they were naming the space of computer science as a collaborative space where people help each other. And that goes against some stereotypes about computer science in the rest of the world. They could see themselves as CS people. You might have noticed that in that final reflection from the lightsaber one. And they identified as different types of computer scientists, as having actual coding skills or being problem solvers. That's all part of being a computer scientist. And there are lots of different types of computer scientists. So those are two analyses that we've done. This was part of our coding scheme for the can't remember which one. One of the portfolio, I think the identity one. I've done a lot of studies, obviously. So if anyone's interested later in getting details about coding data, not coding computer science programs, would be happy to talk about that process. It's usually a ground up process for us. And a lot of the research helped us develop more quant research on the curriculum. So you saw a hint of this in the video. We leveled up each year, and this last year we worked on a more quant analysis with 15 teachers. Not all 156 students turned in consent and assent forms. That is an effort in and of itself, just getting consent and assent back. We worked in schools with, I'd say, majority marginalized populations, marginalized being African American and Latino in the case of Latinx, in the case of computer science, or low SES, or female. All those are marginalized populations. You could get into more detail on that. We measured like English language learning, parent education, those sorts of things as measures of SES. We have a survey. It's been validated, and I'm very proud of it. We actually have a bigger and better survey now that still only takes 10 minutes to do in the class. So I gotta say, it's a big issue. If you're going to do an hour-long survey, no one's going to finish it. So I do not do that. But 10 minutes you can do. We looked at, in this version, we looked at confidence, fascination, expression. There were no instruments that we could find looking at students' sense of creativity with computer science. But there's so much going back 30, 40 years where kids are learning computing by designing things. So we felt that that needed to be developed, and it worked. We now have more instruments related to growth and fixed mindset, if you're familiar with those, programming anxiety, and just broader programming self-concept, as well as with specific E-textiles abilities. Like, I think I can identify a problem in Arduino, or if I face a problem in E-textiles, I can solve it. So they're self-beliefs about that. And we got significant results pre-post on 3, not on value, regardless of gender, home language, or family education. So one of the things that I often hear, and part of why we designed E-textiles in the first place, is to tackle gender representation in computer science. But E-textiles works for everyone. I think because there's such openness and you get to choose what you're going to make. And, very regularly, I go and I ask students, what was your favorite part about this? And they're like, I could make whatever I wanted. And I'd be, no, you couldn't make whatever you wanted. We said you had to have 2 patches, 4 lights, 4 lighting patterns. And they're like, oh, but it felt like I could make whatever I want. So to me, that's a real powerful success of the curriculum, because they're getting lots of depth in terms of their circuitry and programming and spatial crafting stuff, but they feel like they can make whatever they want. We compared those results on interests with their actual achievement in the classroom. And we measured this by making a rubric for their human sensor project. So to what degree did they do everything from commenting code to having functional sensors that actually worked? This was a very detailed rubric. And we also had one on portfolios. So here's sort of the ranges of students. This is where students were more lacking. And basically, if they did not finish their human sensor project, we actually found a correlation. They did not feel as confident in their coding abilities. So if they didn't finish the fourth project, which was the second major project with coding in it, it makes sense. This sort of was really helpful for us to understand the importance of that fourth and final project in the curriculum for students' confidence in their ability to code. We also looked at their portfolios. We developed a less open-ended rubric. So I showed you the ground up analysis, or like, hey, they're debugging and they're iteratively solving and stuff. But we looked at the portfolio with that. And we also looked at prior teacher experience. So we found in that year with 15 teachers, 3 of them had prior experience teaching the unit, and all the students in those 3 classes performed better and had stronger gains in interest. It makes sense. Honestly, the teachers were doing it for the second or third time. Teacher experience can make a difference. So, yay, these are some take-home points. Here are a few things that we are happening right now. I said we're doing this online professional development. So now I'm studying experienced computer science teachers, their needs. What do they need to stay? And one reason we're studying this is because there's been so much emphasis in computer science education as a discipline of, we need more teachers. We don't have enough people who know anything about computer science to teach classes. And so a lot of the training has focused on really basic, like, you need content skills. But what about all the teachers who have some skills? What do they need to stay engaged? What are the unique challenges that CS teachers are facing? They're often the only one in their school, sometimes the only one in a city or a county. In rural areas, they're often building programs. They're working with administrators who never took computer science when they were in high school. And so they're trying to communicate to administrators. And there are like, okay, at least a few years ago, half of the principals in the United States thought that computer science involved like Microsoft PowerPoint. By the way, it doesn't. So yeah, we are also analyzing our debugging by design stuff. We're submitting a paper tonight on our new expanded instrument on student self-beliefs that includes growth mindset, which is like the ability, like the idea that you are capable of learning, that your talent is not innate, that you can learn in the field of, say, computer science. We had positive gains for when we did debugging by design. And I seriously, doing E-textiles virtually during the pandemic in 11 classrooms. Actually, 8 of those were participating in the quasi-experimental study where we had teachers doing the debugging by design unit, or to make sure it was equivalent, we had just an extra week-long unit in the other classes. So they all had equal amounts of E-textiles time, but the students who actually made bugs for each other and then solved them in an exchange, especially the students whose parents had higher education, it made a difference for them. So that was remarkable, and we'll work on that paper over the summer. And we're analyzing clinical interviews where we like, hey, here's this thing, how would you debug it? So we're trying to, how do you test and assess people's ability to debug things? So we're trying these think aloud clinical interviews for that, in the middle of analyzing that. And we're in the middle of analyzing our online professional development. And by the way, it's very difficult to try to analyze teachers teaching in multiple states, because I can't actually go in and gather information about students, even a survey, without permission from the district. And there's just no way we're doing that with 8 districts. So that's challenge. So instead, we're having the teachers meet in buddy groups and reflect on their teaching practices and what's going well and what's being a challenge. So I hope I've left at least 15 minutes for discussion here. So I'm gonna stop sharing, but I can put up more slides or images if you need.
Great. Yeah, we have about 15 minutes for questions. There were a couple questions in the chat. The first one is, do students keep the projects and materials when they're done?
They can. So this is something that is an emerging, interesting area to me. So we, as part of our research grant, we provide enough where students could keep all the projects. So we give that to teachers, but the teachers have a bit of a longer term agenda. When our grants end, they want to still be able to teach the E-textiles unit, and the cost is about $40 a student, which isn't a ton. Is like the cost of a language workbook, but it's not trivial either. So what we have found is that teachers will keep some projects. The third project is a collaborative one, so it makes sense that they would keep that. They display it. And the teachers have developed different protocols for whether students get to keep it. So like one teacher says, all right, you can keep your project if you bring this paper back signed by a family member and another teacher that you have showed your project to. Because if you're not willing to share it with them, then you probably don't want it enough. Otherwise, they might pull apart and recycle the projects so that the materials can be reused. So it's a sort of. I see this. Okay, the materials, since we're talking about materials, our grant pays for the initial setup. So we have like scissors and stuff. You don't have to buy those every year. Although apparently needles are not a renewable. You'd think they could be reused, but they're just lost frequently. So, but a lot of the other things, depending on how many projects students keep. So the teachers are developing all sorts of different ways of funding it, whether they're reusing stuff, doing GoFundMes, trying to argue for funding from their schools. Just sort of gets into whether it's done by a grant where we can provide it or broader.
Great. And then there was another question actually before that one that says, do certain local marginalized communities still have practicing craftspeople who can be used as a resource and integrated into e-textile programs in some way?
So yes, but of course the more qualitative answer is yes and. So I mean, I'm working right now primarily in Southern California in this big urban area. So I'll answer that first, and then I'll talk about some of my colleagues who have worked with Indigenous peoples. So here, one of the exciting, there's this one teacher at one of the schools in the most under-resourced areas of Los Angeles, like in terms of density of population, income, and like being hit hard by the pandemic. Like it's that school. And he's done this great thing where during the curriculum, he brings in mothers to help. And it's fantastic because a lot of moms know how to sew. I mean, a lot of dads do too, quite frankly, but a lot of moms know how to sew in that area. And all of a sudden the mother's expertise is valuable in computer science, which I think is fabulous, because anytime you can pose funds of knowledge, if you're familiar with that framework, so people's everyday knowledge as valuable in an academic setting, then you make this nice connection between home culture and school culture. So other teachers have done some of that. I've also seen just on a more individual level, like I know this one high school student in Philadelphia that we worked with some years ago. Her father was an electrician, and she could really bond with him over that. One of my students at university, her dad also was an electrician, at least as a hobby, and she was a fashion design student, and he helped her on her final project where she had to, sewing wasn't going to cut it for the distances she wanted. She made this like bell skirt, like if you've seen Bridgerton, like that kind of skirt, but with twinkling lights on it. It was very elaborate, but the conductive thread, too much resistance built up. So to really get it to work, she had to solder the lights. So her dad taught her how to solder. And he's like, you know, honey, when I found out we were having a girl, I never thought I'd be helping her solder her dress when she grew up. So my colleague, Kristen Searle, who worked with us on our original E-textiles informal workshops in Philadelphia, has spent her entire career working with Indigenous populations, particularly American Indians in Arizona and Utah. And so she does work to capitalize on local knowledge. One thing that she has found in some workshops is that both boys and girls are really good at fine needlework because of the beading that they do. At the same time, she got into this big argument with another graduate student who was working on their project. He was in arts ed and he is an Indigenous member, and he just did not think it was okay to have pink and purple lights. But that's what the kids wanted. They wanted pink and purple lights, and they wanted to make stuff about Hello Kitty and anime stuff and all those sorts of things. So a little bit of tension in terms of, what's relevant to the kids and what our outside ideas about what is culturally relevant might be. You got to be very careful to, I think, work on that negotiation and not impose stereotypes about what we think is Native knowledge and those sorts of things. So it can be an interesting negotiation. They have designed some projects that have helped kids to say, look at like one of their projects, it's not, you can't just make anything, you have to make something about a local native plant. And they're encouraged to talk to elders and stuff. So they sometimes leverage these projects to encourage conversation between generations in the community. So.
A couple of shorter questions. One is, what grades is this appropriate for?
So we designed the curriculum for grades 9 to 12, but E-textiles can be done with a lot of ages. I've taught it to senior citizens. I think the younger you get, it depends on their prior skills with sewing. So not everyone has developed fine motor skills. Like I learned embroidery when I was in 5th grade, but depending on where you're working, that may not be true. So, but I have my colleague Colby Tolfagrill at Utah State is doing a lot of work in science ed, and she's doing with like mid-elementary, like 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, and doing some really great things. I think also you can do all this stuff with copper tape if you are careful about it. And so she's using sort of integrating science and history to have kids trace forced migrations in their history, which are an ignored area in many social studies classes. And sort of using E-textiles to either map timelines or to show like picture a map and a light goes on in one part and the light goes on another part. You can sort of trace migration paths. So it helps bring that all together.
And how many weeks does the unit last?
Depends on the teacher, 10 to 14. Right now, our first new crop of teachers that we've trained online is starting, and we've warned them, you're going to need more time in the first year. And that's because when kids are making their own projects, what has happened over and over again that we've seen is that the teachers don't want to pull them back from all of the decorating. So they see high engagement from their students, and it's very hard to get them to stop coloring, adding sequins, adding extra stuff, which is very time consuming, and getting some of the circuitry and the coding done to make it functional. So it's a tension. And as teachers do it in their 2nd year and 3rd year, they get a little bit better about knowing where they can just say, okay, yeah, you can do that at home, or you can come in at lunch, or you can come in after school and do that. In class, we're going to focus on the things that I know are hard for students to do without extra support. So.
And can you use Java to do the programming?
When you're using a microcontroller, you have to use whatever that software that microcontroller is designed to use. So there are some options. We use the Adafruit Circuit Playground. We started off with a LilyPad Arduino. Circuit Playground just had more bells and whistles on it and was also cheaper midway through our curriculum development. So that's what we've used. And they've also helped us design kits and offered them at a substantial discount to teachers. So really working with the suppliers was one of my adventures on that. You could use a Raspberry Pi, but I think that also uses Arduino. Make code. Microsoft has made a block-based environment that translates block-based to Java-like, but not quite Java, text-based code. And so if you have, but you can't just use any circuit playground, you have to have a particular one. You could also use the BBC microbit. So it's dependent on the particular hardware you're going to use, how much money you want to spend on it, and what are the particular affordances of that specific hardware. So we have generally stuck for us in the curriculum with the Circuit Playground Classic because you don't have to do anything to it to use it on Arduino. And students really, using text-based language is difficult for novices, but in terms of their identity, they feel it's professional. Even though honestly, you can do just as sophisticated things with a block-based language like Scratch, like incredibly sophisticated things, but it helps them. And it does, some of the teachers have commented that the way Arduino works dovetails nicely with, like, say, Java and APCS, although obviously it's different.
What are the constraints, if any, on what students are allowed to do when they create a bug?
Oh, we worked on that over 2 years. If I had more time, maybe in the next hour, if we have time, I will share the sick cloud barfing up a rainbow that a couple of students designed. That was literally what they designed. It's a rainbow barf. It was great. We limited them to 2 crafting bugs because those are very difficult to fix. And we only give students one class period to fix things. So they have like 4 or 5 days to design, and then they have to trade, and they have like an hour to fix things. And that's exciting and fun. We make them have 6 bugs total. They could put a bug into, well, there's lots of bugs you can put into the code. But we have at least 2 bugs cannot be caught by the compiler. So if you're familiar with coding, you might run a check and it's going to find any grammar errors. It's like a word processing check when Microsoft Word or Google Docs is like, you misspelled this, you know, and it puts a little red underline under that word or something like that. They need at least 2 bugs that can't be caught by the software. So like when that kid with the lightsaber had the semicolon outside of the bracket, that is something that would be caught by the compiler. But a bug where, let's say, your if else command, you could mess that up in a certain way, or a lot of stuff with variables. So it's hard to get into some of these bugs without getting very context specific into domains that not everyone here is programmed in Arduino necessarily. So yes, and there's also a social process in the classroom where we've encouraged teachers to, at certain points, like, okay, everyone's making the same bugs. This is going to be very boring to solve, so vary it up. And then they might challenge students to design sneakier bugs. And then of course there's the accidental bugs that they design, which are very laugh out loud, because yes, we've had many students not realize they were designing a bug. And then of course, when people solve it, sometimes the students see bugs that don't exist because of misperception. So that is also very entertaining.
And this will be our last question for tonight. Have you followed prior students to see if they go into a computer science related profession as adults?
I wish. Honestly, if you picture the very first students that we worked with in classrooms was in spring 2016, and they were mostly freshmen, maybe some juniors. That's only 6 years ago. That's not even long enough to follow them into a profession, say after college. It would be at least interesting to follow and see if students pursued something like went into AP, computer science, or took a computing course in college. That's hard to do because following students over multiple years, you have to have a really big sample because you can have students that change schools. And how do you follow them and those sorts of things? So that's kind of, our grants have not covered that, but I think that is an area that's really lacking in research, is that longitudinal stuff. But when you have a grant that only lasts 3, maybe 4 years, it's very hard to support that kind of following. But maybe for someone's research work, you guys can do that.
Excellent. I think that's a great place to end for tonight. Thank you very much for joining us here. For the students and faculty from UMass Dartmouth, we'll be going to the other Zoom space for the informal Q&A with Dr. Fields. And for everyone else, thank you so much for joining us. And I hope that we will see you again in April. Claps.
This was fun. Thanks for all the great questions and for sharing a little bit about what you've made.
And you'll want to read the comments really quick because people are giving you all kinds of comments.
That's so great.